In a time when real conversations feel almost extinct, something incredible happened on live television. Two women, divided by politics, generations, and belief, found unexpected common ground not by shouting louder, but by sharing their deepest scars. What unfolded wasn't just rare, it was unforgettable. Stay with us because this story may just restore your faith in what's still possible for America. The Newseum's Freedom Forum Theater hummed with an electric, expectant tension that could almost be felt through the polished wood of the seats. Tonight wasn't just another political panel or talk show, it was something different, something heavier. Billed as part of The View's special Civic Dialogue Week, the event had drawn an unusually charged crowd: seasoned policymakers, journalism professors, Georgetown students, and everyday Americans who had lived through decades of political swings, wars, and social revolutions. At the heart of it all sat two women who seemed, on paper, destined to clash. Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in history, poised and polished, her sharp mind shaped by battles in the political arena. Opposite her, Joy Behar, the legendary comedian and co-host, known for her razor wit and fierce skepticism, especially toward faith expressed in public life. The camera zoomed in as they exchanged their first guarded smiles. Thin, cautious, almost reluctant. Everyone in the theater knew that beneath those polite courtesies was a collision course brewing, one that mirrored the divides many Americans felt in their own families and communities. Would it erupt into another televised shouting match? Another sign that real dialogue was dead? Or, though few dared hope, could something unexpected happen tonight? Could two people who embodied opposing worlds somehow find common ground? The lights dimmed slightly, the theme music faded, and as the host welcomed the national audience, a sense of history tingled in the air. Whatever was about to happen, it would not be easily forgotten. Karoline Leavitt and Joy Behar could not have come from more different worlds, and yet tonight their paths crossed in a way neither could fully control. Karoline, barely 30, had already carved out a career that most seasoned operatives could only dream of. Born and raised in the quiet stretches of New Hampshire, she rose from small-town roots to the epicenter of American power, serving as White House press secretary during one of the most turbulent eras in recent memory. Sharp, disciplined, and measured, Karoline was seen by supporters as a beacon of youthful patriotism and by critics as a polished warrior in a divided political landscape. Beneath the crisp suits and practiced smiles, though, there was another Karoline few knew, a young woman who had tasted personal loss early and carried the quiet weight of it in every public appearance. Across from her sat Joy Behar, a household name whose career spanned generations. At 81, Joy had seen cultural revolutions rise and fall, had weathered the storms of controversy and applause with the same dry humor that had made her a fixture in American homes. A daughter of Brooklyn, Joy's skepticism toward authority and faith had been hardened by years of personal and political battles. Yet, behind the sharp one-liners and knowing smirks was a woman who had also faced heartbreak, brushes with mortality, and moments of wondering whether there was more to life than the debates she so expertly navigated. Two women, divided by politics, age, and temperament, but linked, perhaps more deeply than either yet understood, by the quiet ache of lived experience. As the stage lights brightened, so did the contrast between them, and the possibility that something far more profound than a debate might unfold. The conversation began, as so many public interviews do, with a veneer of civility. A few light jokes, a quick acknowledgement of the unusual setting, polite smiles traded like thin armor. Joy Behar, ever the veteran performer, kept the banter breezy at first, her sharp instincts hidden behind warm familiarity. But seasoned viewers, especially those who had lived long enough to read the deeper currents beneath polite words, could sense the undertow gathering. After a few softball questions about communication strategy and the White House's messaging priorities, Joy shifted in her seat, narrowed her eyes slightly, and leaned forward with a smile that didn't quite reach them. "Carol," she said, her tone laced with casual disapproval, masked as curiosity, "lately you've been talking about faith and purpose on your public platforms. It's surprising, coming from someone whose career was built in the sharp-edged world of politics. Some would say it's a little convenient. There it was, the first real shot fired, wrapped in velvet but unmistakably pointed. The audience murmured, a few shifting in their seats. Karoline's posture didn't change, but a small flicker crossed her eyes, a flash of recognition that the real conversation had finally begun. She tilted her head slightly, buying a second to steady herself. "It's a fair question," she replied, her voice calm but firmer now, "and one I'd be glad to answer." Around them the tension sharpened. The other hosts, sensing the pivot from friendly to fraught, grew quieter, their smiles tighter. The camera zoomed in, capturing the barely perceptible stiffening of Karoline's shoulders and the glint of challenge in Joy's expression. It wasn't just a question of faith anymore. It was a public test of authenticity, of whether conviction could survive under the hot lights of national scrutiny. And both women knew it. The dance had begun, and there would be no turning back. Joy didn't let the moment slip away. Sensing the small opening, she pressed harder, her voice sharpening into the kind of directness that had made her both beloved and controversial for decades. "Come on, Karoline," she said, waving a hand as if brushing aside the younger woman's carefully measured tone. "You spent years crafting political narratives, learning how to sway public opinion, and now, suddenly, you're quoting scripture, talking about the soul? Forgive me, but it sounds like a rebranding exercise, not a revelation." The words landed heavily. The audience tensed, unsure whether to laugh, gasp, or wait for Karoline's response. In the control room, producers leaned forward in their chairs. They knew this was the kind of combustible moment that could either create a media firestorm or something none of them could yet predict. Karoline held Joy's gaze, the smile fading from her lips. For a beat, she said nothing. A silence heavy with calculation, but also with something more fragile. A decision. She could meet fire with fire, defend herself with the same sharp-edged tools that had served her in countless press briefings. Or she could try something riskier, something that didn't come wrapped in armor. She chose the latter. "You're right, Joy," she began, and a ripple moved through the audience. "Politics trains you to think in strategies, to measure every word against potential fallout. For a long time, that was the only framework I trusted." She paused, letting the admission settle in. "But life doesn't always respect the strategies we build. Sometimes it tears them apart." Joy, sensing that Karoline wasn't slipping into defensive spin but genuinely laying something bare, leaned back slightly, arms crossed but no longer hostile. The room seemed to hold its breath. Karoline continued, her voice low but gaining strength. "I didn't start speaking publicly about faith because it was convenient. Frankly, it's been anything but. I started because silence began to feel dishonest. Not to voters, not to critics, but to myself. It wasn't a rebuttal, it was a revelation. And for the first time that night, the lines between combatants blurred, if only slightly. Something deeper was stirring beneath the surface tension, and everyone in that theater could feel it." Karoline shifted in her seat, her hands unclasping from the careful posture she had maintained throughout the interview. For a moment, she simply looked at Joy, past the cameras, past the audience, past the roles they were expected to play. There was a vulnerability there, raw and unguarded, that older viewers would recognize instantly, the face of someone about to speak a truth they hadn't rehearsed. "Joy," she said, her voice softening in a way that pulled the entire room closer, "may I tell you something I rarely share publicly? Something not about politics or strategy, but about why I even dared to bring faith into my life?" Joy hesitated, surprised by the turn, but nodded silently. The producers didn't cut to commercial. The host didn't interrupt. For once, in the fast, ruthless cycle of modern media, real time slowed to make space for something real. Karoline exhaled slowly, gathering her words. "When I was 16, my best friend, someone I grew up with, died in a car accident." A collective stillness seized the room. One moment we were talking about colleges and prom and stupid plans for the summer, and the next he was just gone. She paused, blinking back the memory. I didn't know how to process it. So I didn't. I buried it under achievement, straight A's, college scholarships, career goals. I built a life around success, because sitting still meant facing the hole that loss had left in me. Joy's expression softened visibly. The mask of the seasoned skeptic cracked just slightly. For years I convinced myself that grief was just a matter of endurance, that if I kept moving fast enough, if I thought hard enough, if I worked long enough, I could outrun it. Karoline's voice wavered, just for a heartbeat. But grief is patient. It waits. It outlasts ambition. She looked down at her folded hands, then back up at Joy. And when life knocked me down again years later, when career plans crumbled and all my carefully built strategies failed, I was forced to stop running, and in that silence, in that emptiness, something else found me. She didn't elaborate yet, she didn't need to. The older members of the audience, those who had buried loved ones, dreams, parts of themselves, could feel the weight of every unsaid word. In that moment, Karoline wasn't the White House press secretary. She wasn't a political combatant. She was simply a human being, standing at the crossroads of loss and grace, inviting others to remember their own crossroads too. The atmosphere inside the Freedom Forum Theater shifted with a suddenness that no camera could fully capture, though millions watching at home would later say they felt it too. The tension that had gripped the room, the wariness, the defensiveness, the sharp edges of debate, seemed to drain away, leaving something raw and profoundly human in its place. For a long beat after Karoline finished speaking, no one rushed to fill the silence. Joy Behar, so often quick with a quip or a skeptical retort, simply sat back in her chair, her arms now uncrossed, her expression unguarded. For the first time all evening, she wasn't playing the role of host or provocateur. She was simply Joy, an 81-year-old woman who had lived through her own losses, her own reckonings, and who suddenly found herself face to face not with an opponent, but with a kindred soul in the struggle to find meaning beyond pain. Across the stage, the other co-hosts were visibly moved. Vivian Marks, normally composed, blinked rapidly to hold back tears. Daphne Sullivan, known for her crisp legal mind, reached discreetly for a tissue. Cassandra Lane pressed a hand to her heart. Miguel Ortega, the show's policy expert, simply looked down, overwhelmed by the rawness of the moment. In the audience, people leaned forward in their seats as if to somehow be closer, some wiping away tears openly. The control room, so often focused on lighting cues and camera angles, sat in stunned silence, technicians exchanging glances that said more than words could. It wasn't just Karoline's story that had touched them. It was the recognition, instant and undeniable, that beneath the banners we wave, the opinions we defend, and the battles we fight, there are wounds that bind us together, wounds that time doesn't erase, only transforms. Joy cleared her throat, blinking against the sudden sting in her own eyes. She opened her mouth to respond, but what came out wasn't another challenge. It was something closer to a whisper, "I'm sorry for your loss." A simple sentence, but in that moment, it was everything. It was the first bridge built not from agreement, but from acknowledgement, the first step toward a different kind of conversation, one rooted not in who is right or wrong, but in the quiet, aching truth that all of us, in the end, are simply trying to heal. The spell of silence broke not with a debate, but with a conversation, a real one, rare and fragile, like glass, blown thin over fire. Karoline smiled gently at Joy, her earlier defenses gone. "May I ask you something?" she said, her tone no longer that of a political figure, but simply a fellow traveler through life's uneven terrain. Joy, still visibly moved, gave a small nod. "You've lived a remarkable life, Joy," Karoline continued, "full of experiences I can only begin to imagine. Has your thinking about faith, about meaning, changed over time?" The shift was unmistakable. The hunted had become the curious, and the question wasn't a tactic, it was an invitation. Joy paused, genuinely taken aback by the vulnerability extended toward her. She leaned forward slightly, abandoning the safety of prepared lines and practiced skepticism. "I was raised Catholic," she began slowly, searching for the right words. Strict household, mass every Sunday, confession, the works. As I got older, life chipped away at those certainties. She chuckled dryly, but there was no bitterness in it. Only memory, losing people you love, facing things that don't have neat answers. I stopped believing in the easy explanations, but... She trailed off, her voice growing softer. After an ectopic pregnancy nearly killed me years ago, there were moments in that hospital room where I wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was more to this life than we can prove. The room listened, breath held, as two women from opposite worlds revealed the fractures that made them whole. Karoline nodded slowly, her own voice threaded with emotion. I think a lot of us carry that wondering. It's easy to dismiss until it isn't, until life forces the question on you whether you're ready or not. Miguel Ortega, normally quick with policy statistics, murmured agreement. Daphne Sullivan, blinking away a tear, leaned closer as if not wanting to miss a word. What followed wasn't a scripted interview, nor a debate to be won. It was a sharing of scars. Joy speaking of disillusionment with religious institutions but still yearning for something larger. Karoline speaking of finding glimpses of meaning in grief, in service, in small moments of grace she couldn't explain away. Other hosts joined in, cautiously at first, then more openly, talking about doubt, faith, the search for purpose beyond careers and headlines. The conversation turned into something rare on American television, an honest reckoning with the realities of belief and disbelief, not framed by outrage or applause lines but by a mutual respect born of shared pain. No one raised their voices, no one won, and for the audience, many of whom had seen decades of division deepen and civility wither, it was a glimpse of something forgotten but deeply missed. Dialogue that sought understanding, not victory. By the time the live broadcast faded to black, something extraordinary had already begun to ripple beyond the walls of the Freedom Forum Theater. Within minutes, clips of the exchange between Karoline Leavitt and Joy Behar flooded social media. Not the usual viral clips of confrontation and humiliation, but something else entirely. Two women, decades apart in age, miles apart in ideology, meeting across a chasm of doubt and pain. Hashtags like real dialogue and faith and doubt trended across platforms usually dominated by outrage. CNN analysts, typically quick to highlight political fireworks, spoke instead of a rare act of civic grace. Fox News anchors praised the moment not for partisan reasons, but for its demonstration of shared humanity beyond political divisions. Even late-night hosts who could easily have mocked the emotional display largely stayed silent, perhaps recognizing that some moments are too real, too sacred for cheap laughs. For ordinary Americans watching at home, especially those over 50 who had lived through decades of growing cynicism, the moment touched a deeper nerve. Support groups for grief counseling reported spikes in website visits the following week. Churches, synagogues, and community centers hosted discussion nights titled Bridging Our Divides, a conversation on loss and hope, inspired by what they had witnessed. Letters poured into ABC's headquarters. Long, handwritten letters thanking the network for airing something that reminded viewers not of what divides them, but of what endures beneath it. And it wasn't just private citizens who noticed. At Georgetown University, political science professors used this segment in lectures about civil discourse. Journalism schools dissected the interview, not as a media gaffe, but as a case study in what happens when people dare to speak from broken places rather than polished podiums. For a brief, shining moment, across a nation weary from endless conflict, Karoline Leavitt and Joy Behar's conversation reminded America of something essential, that behind every opinion lies a human story, and sometimes the bridge between two sides isn't built with arguments, but with honesty, humility, and the quiet courage to simply listen. In the quiet days that followed the broadcast, both Karoline Leavitt and Joy Behar took time to process what had unfolded, not as public figures, but as individuals, changed by an encounter they hadn't expected. Karoline, usually swift to pivot from one event to the next, paused. On her personal account, away from official White House communications, she posted a simple but profound reflection. Sometimes the walls we build around ourselves are stronger than we realize, and sometimes the right conversation can begin to take them down. She didn't frame it as a political victory, nor as a media triumph. It was, simply, a moment of human connection that had left its mark on her. Joy, too, surprised her longtime viewers during the next taping of The View. Holding a few handwritten notes, something she rarely did, she spoke with an unusual tenderness. "I pride myself on asking tough questions," she began, her voice steady but softer than usual. "But I've been thinking a lot about that night with Karoline. I realized I started from a place of mockery, not curiosity. And yet, because she answered with honesty instead of anger, we ended up somewhere better than either of us probably expected." Her co-hosts nodded, visibly moved. Joy added, almost as an afterthought, "We don't always get those moments on TV. We should treasure them when we do." In their own ways, both women had been humbled, and both had grown. Not by abandoning their beliefs, but by remembering that the heart behind the belief matters just as much as the argument itself. Long after the stage lights dimmed and the cameras were packed away, the impact of that conversation between Karoline Leavitt and Joy Behar continued to ripple outward, far beyond the glossy sets and trending hashtags. For once, what happened on television wasn't just entertainment or outrage packaged for ratings. It was a reminder of something older, deeper and truer than the latest news cycle. In a divided America where shouting had too often replaced listening, here were two women from opposing worlds choosing, even if only for a few moments, to see each other as human beings first. It wasn't a surrender of their convictions. It was an acknowledgement that convictions mean little if they strip us of compassion. For viewers, especially those who had witnessed decades of American change, upheaval, and resilience, the exchange was a kind of balm. It recalled a time when disagreement didn't mean hatred, when political rivals could still share laughter, sorrow, and respect. It reminded them that faith and doubt are not opposing weapons, but parallel roads winding toward the same unseen horizon. A search for meaning, for hope, for connection in a life that guarantees none of these things easily. Karoline and Joy's moment didn't end with a viral clip or a flurry of opinion pieces. It lived on in quieter ways. In family conversations reopened after years of silence, in handwritten notes tucked into Sunday bulletins, in the silent prayers offered by people who hadn't prayed in a long time. It lived on because it wasn't about winning an argument. It was about the deeper, harder work of understanding. And perhaps that is why the memory of that night lingers still, because in an era when so much of public life feels hollow, staged, and hopelessly divided, a conversation between two unlikely women offered something revolutionary, the simple, stunning truth that beneath every title, every ideology, every carefully constructed identity, there is a beating human heart longing to be known, not defeated. In a world increasingly defined by division and noise, this story reminds us that genuine connection is still possible when we dare to move beyond labels and listen with humility. Karoline Leavitt and Joy Behar show that vulnerability, not argument, builds the strongest bridges. Their unlikely dialogue taught us that faith and doubt, experience and youth, left and right, all can meet on the common ground of shared humanity. True understanding isn't about winning debates. It's about honoring the unseen battles each of us carries. In the end, it's compassion, not certainty, that truly heals.